excited to be here with you today to talk about the problems micro frontends won't solve that no one wants to talk about. My name is Jennifer Wadella. You can follow me on Twitter at OMG I'm the director of Angular development at a consultancy called Bitovi. So I spend a lot of time consulting with clients, hearing about the problems they have. And a lot of times they look to reach for micro frontends as their solution. So I've seen a lot of good and a lot of bad when it comes to this topic. I'm also the co-host of the Angular Plus Show, a podcast about Angular software development and much, much more, as well as being an Angular GDE and a kombucha brewing crazy plant lady. Before we get started, I think this is a perfect meme to kick off this talk because it summarizes my feelings towards micro frontends very well. And this is me listening to my clients say they think they need to implement micro frontends. And I say this a little tongue-in-cheek because in technology, we do this thing where something new and shiny comes out and we get very excited and we think it's going to solve all our problems and make everything better. And, a lot of people will buy into the hype and then not realize that, hey, every technical decision we make has trade-offs. And that includes micro frontends. There are a lot of valid reasons to consider adopting a micro frontend strategy, and I've seen clients have good reasons for this. I spent a lot of time in Angular, and so there are some of my clients that are still running legacy AngularJS applications. And in order to upgrade from AngularJS to Angular, that's an entire application rewrite. And that's a pretty significant undertaking, especially if this is software that teams have been building on, 5, 6, 7 years. And so in some cases, it may make sense to adopt micro frontends to enable being able to build out small pieces of an application at a time to replace a legacy application. A lot of teams also reach for micro frontends when they're trying to reduce the difficulty of shipping features in a timely manner. Having the ability to kind of break apart a front end and be able to focus on shipping features independently, I think has a lot of allure to a lot of teams when it comes to getting those features out faster. I also hear about teams that, want to use their preferred tech stack. JavaScript engineers are very picky. We like what we like. And so sometimes an option to support keeping engineering teams happy is to allow them and give them opportunities to use the tech that they want to be using. And so there's an idea that with adopting micro frontends, you could have one micro frontend in React, one in Angular, one in Svelte, one in Vue, that still come together to create a cohesive, single page application that feels as one to the user. And then I think there's another really big push for allowing software companies to embrace feature-oriented teams. Software is complex, business rules are complex, and when you're dealing with a really complex product, that can be a lot, but if you're able to break something apart where teams can be built around specific features and delivering real value to the user, they get to kind of condense their domain knowledge to focus on a specific area, and I think there's a huge draw there. So all sorts of great reasons to reach for micro frontends, along with plenty of not great reasons to reach for micro frontends. And there are a lot of companies using micro frontends successfully. I don't want anybody to think this is a micro frontend bashing talk at all. There are a lot of companies that have embraced micro frontends and done it really well, learned a lot along the way. And so my hope from this talk is if you are exploring embracing micro frontend architecture, looking for ways to implement it, that instead of getting excited about the new and shiny, you are well aware of the trade-offs that you're going to be making and the problems that you will start to run into when starting to implement micro frontend architecture. There are a lot of different approaches that people are using with micro frontends, and actually this is not a new concept. We have a new fancy name for it that's kind of become a big deal in the last couple of years, but we've been doing micro frontends for a long time, whether we've realized it or not. If you've ever brought in one application into another via an iframe, you've been using micro frontends. And I've seen a variety of different approaches. When I've dealt with teams that are upgrading legacy AngularJS code, I've seen them do some server-side compilation where they are bringing in their different files according to maybe routes or where a user is navigating to kind of implement that approach. There are some new really cool open source solutions. I'm a big fan of SingleSpy. I think this is a great solution that you can look into if you're looking to prototype or test micro frontends for the first time. In the Angular world, and it's expanded outside of, we have now Module Federation, which was made available with Webpack 5. I joke about Angular because we have Webpack built in under the hood, and so anytime new Webpack functionality comes out, we get it with the latest version of Angular. And so I feel like we were a community who were quick to embrace exploring Module Federation and its options made available via Webpack. And of course, we have Ionic and a lot of companies and organizations exploring how they can help support the the micro front end movement. So lots of new API proposals, lots of exciting things happening that are continuing to push us down this pathway. And if you've, been looking into micro front ends, you're like, oh, this sounds awesome. Like, let's go. I want to implement this right now. I want to caution you and say, all right, hang on, you little Frankensteins. Let's slow down. Let's think about what we're doing. Because this is oftentimes what will happen is we are taking these pieces and we're mashing them all together, and we may unintentionally create a monster. And I've heard stories, I've seen this happen in my own experience where, we have this great idea of splitting apart our application into these different micro front ends, and then coming together and getting something really, really scary. So I want to caution you against that. And in order to do so, I would like you to walk through a couple scenarios with you that I've seen before that teams have encountered that you may not have thought about in this excitement to embrace micro front ends. So scenario number one, we have a feature team that spins up and they start to work on a new feature. They have their business requirements. They understand what the user is looking for. They understand, the value that this is going to bring to the business, and that is their focus. But a couple things may end up happening while they're building out this new feature. They might end up replicating code. Maybe there are some utility functions that have already been used in another micro front end or somewhere else in the application that they're not aware of because they have tunnel vision on their new feature. And so they're writing a lot of duplicate code. Maybe they are having to make a request to an API for data that has already been requested somewhere else in the application. And so where we were making one API request before, we are now making two redundant requests. And there are a lot of situations like this that start to happen very, very quickly, and all of a sudden the application performance tanks. The users are upset. Why is the application so slow? What's going on? This new feature team is like, I don't know, my micro front end works just fine. But we lose sight of the whole of what we're building, which at the end of the day, we are still shipping this one holistic application to our user. And so these are some real significant issues that can creep up on us when we are developing in these silos. And so this is something that teams are going to have to be aware of. They are going to have to explore and figure out solutions on how to prevent this kind of thing from happening. I will say I've, seen projects not even employing micro front ends where I've seen 20 plus requests to the same API to fetch the same amount of data just because teams weren't aware of what was going on in the application. And that will really, really, really start to throttle your app's performance. And so, yeah, you may be able to ship code out the door faster with micro front ends, but is that leading to a better experience for your user, which is what generates dollars at the end of the day? Scenario number two, there's a critical bug, it gets logged over the weekend. Because a user is experiencing this application as a whole, they don't understand that it's made up of these different independent parts. And so it can be really, really difficult for somebody to determine who gets the bug, what team owns this, whose responsibility is it for fixing it? Was it due to a new code deployment? Was this due to an adverse effect because of communication between two different micro front ends? So there's a lot of process issues that you need to look into solving in addition to embracing the technology behind implementing micro front end architecture. Scenario number three. One of the cool things about micro front ends is the fact that we can have these feature-oriented teams, and so we can have, a UXer, a front-end developer, a back-end developer, a QA, maybe a product owner, and their sole focus is, providing value to the user. Well, maybe part of that includes the UXer dreaming up like this great new design for this widget or whatever it is. The dev team's excited about it. They're like, yeah, users are going to love this. So they go ahead and implement this in the micro front end. But all of a sudden now it has a different look and feel from the rest of the application. And if you're not thinking about this, if you're not thinking about your micro front end as a part of a whole, this can really creep up, and you're getting into Frankenstein territory. So again, this is something you have to look out for. I will say, one of the brilliant ways we can solve this, and not just at a micro front end level, but at an app level in general, is by embracing design systems and component libraries. So there are effective strategies and solutions, but of course those need their own process and project management as well. But these are really real things that you start to run into with micro front ends. Scenario number 4, we've got a dev team, they get a change request, and so they go ahead and ship that. Their unit tests are passing, everything is fine. But this change breaks another app. Maybe it has a dependency on this app. It causes something unexpected. And because we have these dev teams that are kind of focused in building in their silos on just their micro front ends and losing picture of that whole, they don't know how to deal with this kind of breaking change. Whose responsibility is it? And even a step beyond that, how do we prevent that breaking change from happening in the first place? How do we make sure that our development and isolation of our one micro front end isn't going to have a negative impact on the rest of the application? A lot of different ways to solve this, but the underlying theme here is these are new problems that your team is going to have to figure out how to solve. And if you're not thinking about them proactively ahead of time when implementing micro front ends, you're going to start to run into some issues and then be scrambling to figure out how to get ahead of the curve with these. Finally, scenario number 5, and another real one here. We've got a mid-level engineer on a feature team that encounters a weird error, and I'm going to refer to Angular for this because this is one of the first things I've seen pop up and really stump teams that are doing Angular development in an attempt to implement micro front ends. So, you can have a mid-level engineer that's pretty good developer, pretty good Angular developer, but Angular's change detection is built on top of Zone.js, and a lot of even the best Angular developers get freaked out by Zone.js. It's a big learning curve. They don't really want to know what's going on under the hood. But this is an issue that comes up very, very quickly, dealing with change detection issues, dealing with Zone.js conflicts, as soon as you implement micro front ends. Because again, you have split apart your application, you've got different instances running on occasion, and if you're not aware of these really intricate under the hood mechanisms behind, and it doesn't matter if it's Angular or whatever framework, you're going to run into some very difficult to debug issues, especially when your standalone application is running fine and working just as intended. And so when we're embracing micro front ends, we are having to resolve a lot of problems that have already been solved by embracing for instance, single framework building one application, where a lot of this knowledge we don't even need to care about as developers. And so you can very, very quickly have an entire, fairly experienced team get roadblocked because of the nuances and issues that you start to run into. So something to be aware of when looking to implement micro front ends. Some scary scenarios. Let's talk about the problems that micro front ends absolutely cannot solve. The big picture here is, shipping good, small, maintainable, clean code, it's hard. Micro front ends can help with this, but they aren't a silver bullet. Of course we want to be shipping performant code. Of course we want to be shipping dry code. We don't want to be spending time rewriting the same functionality across teams. We want to make sure that, things are maintainable and scalable. But micro front ends are not the solve all for this problem. The thing with this problem, it takes communication. It takes being conscious about the code that we are writing and the impact of the user and having an eye on the big picture. And the other thing that's going to happen is we're going to create a whole lot of new problems. So we might solve our one-off problems of, needing to upgrade an application in pieces, or being able to embrace feature-oriented teams, or be able to have teams work in their independent frameworks and bring everything together. But we're reintroducing a whole lot of architecture problems that we need to figure out how to solve again. So we're going to have to figure out cross-app communication. Are your applications going to attempt to share state? Are they going to communicate back and forth, or are they just going to live in their own world and risk making repeated API calls and code bloat? Are you going to risk duplicated code? If you are going to try and avoid this, how are you going to avoid this? If teams are working in silos, how are they going to be aware of what they may or may not be duplicating? How are you going to share common code if you are, again, trying to kind of avoid some of this duplication? We love micro-frontends because it allows us to separate, but the more we separate, the more tunnel vision we get and lose sight of the big picture or the common goal or the common, utilities that we have available to share with each other. How are we going to maintain a consistent style in UX? What happens when one of the teams wants to embrace Tailwind and they are writing everything that way, and then another team wants to embrace a component library, and all of a sudden you have a lot of conflicts there? How are you going to handle deployment automation? I will say, one of the first questions I like to ask when clients start to talk about micro-frontends is I'll be like, all right, well, tell me about your DevOps process. Tell me about how, your CI/CD works. Because if you're struggling to ship one application, now you're going to struggle to ship as many micro-front-end applications as you have. So if you do not have a good deployment automation process in place, you're going to run into struggles. There are a lot of questions that you're going to have to solve. Where are your micro-front-ends going to be hosted, where they're going to be pulled together into the root? And I've run into situations on clients where maybe they've had a local NPM registry. We're trying to get code out the door. We're trying to get a feature QA'd, and that NPM registry is slow. And so we're kind of in this state of limbo, maybe waiting 6-7 hours out of a working 8-hour business day for one of our micro front ends to deploy properly and be available in the rest of the app so somebody can go through and QA it, do end-to-end testing. So you really need to have your deployment process locked down before even thinking about, attempting to end scale that. Code quality maintenance is another big thing. I've seen a lot of teams that care about code quality, but when you're splitting out into micro front ends and people are doing everything a different way across different projects, you can sometimes really struggle with your code quality maintenance and having the proper checks in place, especially if you have a new team that onboards and maybe they're not familiar with everything that your company does or that the style guide that your software team operates against. Maybe you don't have great linting or something like that in place. You all of a sudden have all these different areas of opportunity for your code quality to suffer because everything is so separated. We talked a little bit in the scenario before, but what are you going to do about breaking changes between applications? How are you going to govern that? Who is going to own that? And how is that going to affect your QA process? How are you going to make sure that maybe you have a QA engineer per micro front end, but who's looking at the whole? Who's keeping their eye on the prize, the big picture of the application that you're shipping at the end of the day? Another fun one we take for granted is clean up on teardown. And, we lose sight of this with modern frameworks because there's so much weight lifted off us that we're not having to deal with. We don't even think about the fact that, okay, I'm writing code. This is getting injected into the DOM. Magic is happening via JavaScript to attach and detach my event listeners. Well, when we start to use micro front ends, we again are having to, pull things into the DOM as it makes sense for our micro apps. And if you have an engineer that is not familiar with this because they did not come from the old school, JavaScript jQuery days like many of us, they are completely unaware of some of this heavy lifting that these frameworks are doing for us and can start to run into issues really, really quickly. I remember in the Backbone.js days, dealing with phantom views and event listeners not getting cleaned up, and then you're dealing with memory leak issues. And this can, again, really cripple some decent mid-level engineers simply because they don't have that experience of building for the native web. Testing is another huge concern. Unit tests are great. They're going to serve for your micro front-end purposes, but if your team is doing end-to-end testing and part of your app can't even be accessed until it passes a gate of another app, what does that end-to-end testing process look like? What does your QA automation look like? Whose responsibility is that? All new problems to solve. So, can we adopt micro front ends and profit? I would hope so. There are people doing it successfully, but you just have to be aware and cognizant of what you're doing. So I do want to leave you a couple strategies with how you can adopt micro frontends and triumph. Number one is communication. And, the more time I spend in consulting, the more time I realize it's never about the code. It's always about the communication. But this is a big piece of implementing micro frontends successfully. I like the idea of adopting consumer-driven contracts. So when you have dependencies between micro frontends, when you have certain practices that you want to adhere to, you want to make sure those are documented in some sort of contract where people are basically agreeing to say, hey, we're going to provide X if you're going to provide Z, we're going to notify you if you do A, you're going to notify us if you do B. You want to make sure you're fostering opportunities for collaboration between verticals. And technical leadership is a really big part of this. You need somebody who is keeping their eye on the big picture. I heard this term a while ago at a conference. We were kind of, talking at a speaker dinner, and somebody mentioned the idea of like a technical shepherd. And I think that's a really, really appropriate kind of thought model to have when looking at implementing a micro frontend architecture. You want somebody who is the shepherd. They're keeping their eye on the entire flock. Everything may be going on independently, but they're the ones kind of keeping track of that whole big picture and trying to make sure everything ties together the way it should, everything stays together and, gets through the gate at the end of the night successfully. So if as you break apart into teams to implement micro frontends, I would encourage you to make sure that you have enough people at a high level, be it technical leadership, be it project management, be it product management, who are keeping their eye on the big picture and understanding how all the independent pieces play together and the effects that they have on each other, and then helping facilitate communication. Collaboration, another big part of this. This is a great quote from Michael Gears on microfrontends.org to agree on naming conventions. So a really great example of this is, CSS. I feel like if you've written old school CSS, you've been burned by the important before. Imagine, everybody kind of going rogue, writing their own CSS and then bringing that all together on one page across different micro frontends. You might run into some issues very, very quickly. Same thing if you're embracing local storage or cookies for, state management or, some offline capabilities. If you agree on naming conventions for every team, so when they're implementing their code, this can actually be really, really helpful so you can identify responsibility, who owns what, and at least be able to route concerns and have communication because you have a little bit of a paper trail around that in the code. I harped on this already, but deployment is huge. Your micro frontends are only as good as your ability to successfully and seamlessly deploy them. So if you struggle to ship one app, you are going to struggle to ship many apps. You're going to have to set up a complete infrastructure per micro frontend application to make sure that it is deploying successfully, being tested successfully, passing your tests successfully. And so you really have to make sure that you have this locked down and can handle this for this strategy to be successful for you. There are issues that you can run into where, let's say something is not set up properly for a micro frontend, that gets shipped out and all of a sudden a chunk of your user-facing application is just not there. Not working. How are you going to handle that? How is that going to keep you from losing money from your users being upset? And of course, documentation. The more documentation, the better. Document your code styles, your dependencies, your deployment flows, and more. One thing I've seen is, these feature teams will spin up implementing micro frontends, and you'll have a handful of engineers, they'll work on this new feature, they'll get it out the door. Well, okay, that feature is done, and so this team gets scrapped, and then they get spread out into other teams, or maybe they get put onto a new feature. And as people get shuffled around, that domain knowledge is lost unless it is properly documented. So the more documentation you can have around your micro frontend to help the ease of onboarding is going to be really, really important and allow you to more fully take advantage of what embracing micro frontend architecture can do for you with the ability to have these independent teams. And the thing to keep in mind is, our modern micro frontend tooling that everybody is excited about is still very new. There's a lot evolving. It's an exciting time. Like, this is what's great about our craft is we can come up with these new ways to solve these problems. But, I still have clients that are running into issues with module federation, where, the tools aren't where they need to be, or are causing issues that their team is just not equipped or advanced enough to be able to debug. So it's important to keep in mind that as you're reaching for these new and modern solutions, that they're still new, they're still, not completely tested. And so you need to make sure that your team is equipped and senior enough and in a place to encounter any issues that they might run into. So big picture here, and this is what I like to end with, is micro frontends are here to solve business problems, not technical ones. Us being able to ship features faster to a user is a business problem. That is something that we are doing to drive business. Us being able to focus better about a user experience and really focus on a significant feature, that is a business problem, not a technical one. And so when I hear clients start to talk about why they think they want to implement micro frontends, I tend to kind of caution them, hey, if your problem is not related to a product or a business need, you probably don't need micro frontends. A great example of this is I had a client and they were running, I believe, an Angular 10 application, and they had some new code to write. And so they're like, well, we could write it in Angular 12 if we do micro frontends. And I was like, whoa. You want to add all this complexity and all these problems instead of just pausing and doing, in the Angular ecosystem, a very not significant upgrade. That seemed like, overkill and a whole lot of drama for not a lot of gain. And again, that was a technical problem, not a business one. So yes, keep in mind, micro frontends for business problems, not for technical ones. There are a lot of great resources to get started. If you're exploring micro frontends for the first time and you're a very hands-on visual person like I am, I really like Single SPA. It's got some great opportunities. You can implement a template that feels a little bit more familiar when trying to understand how to bring these different applications into the DOM. On our Bitovi blog, we have a great blog on how to build a micro frontend with Webpack's module federation. Webpack, I don't want to rag on you, but your documentation is rough. And so in our blog post, we kind of call out all the different options and configurations, what they are and what they mean. That makes the journey a little bit easier into learning. We did a 4-part micro frontend series on the Angular Plus show. In our first episode, What Are Micro Frontends, is actually one of my favorite podcasts that we've ever recorded, with Luca, who is a speaker here as well. So feel free to give that a listen. And I highly recommend following Zach Jackson on Twitter for all things Module Federation. He's been one of the powerhouses behind that, putting out a ton of great ideas. And so he's just a great person to follow to see what's going on in the Module Federation and micro frontend landscape. If you have any questions, I would love to hear them, but these slides are available at microfrontendproblems.jenniferwadella.com. If you need help with Angular, if you need help with micro frontends, or talking your team out of micro frontends, which I get this request a lot actually, I'd love to hear from you, so feel free to reach out to me at any time. You can contact me at jennifer@bitovi.com. I hope you have a great time at this summit. This is a fun topic to talk about, both the good and the bad. So I hope this is helpful in your micro frontend journey and choosing a decision that's right for you and your team.